60 BC began with wild fluctuations in the east. While Crete advanced further into Egypt, Persia almost entirely broke down, giving way to Media in the north, Tylos in the south, Morea in the east, and Phrygia in the west, picking at its corpse, only holding a small enclave of land on the Sinus Persicus. Also worth mentioning is the successful Jewish revolt in Phrygia, which was based out of Masada, reconquering all the way from Jerusalem to the coast. Meanwhile, back west, Caro Caritas, chief of all Avarignia, began the export of amber, precious metals, pearls, and lumber in order to directly fund the construction of the Senate chambers. Shortly after this, a revolt of 3,000 Simulchian cultists, the first of its kind, broke out in Mirobriga, Lusitania, far to the south on the border with Carthage. Headed up by a particularly zealous man named Gela Senua, he marched his men north and conquered Cobalcorum almost without a fight. In fact, the first 3 armies sent to quell him failed to do so. Caro Caritas then personally led an army of 11,000 men south, crushing them at the Battle of Baniensium, but not without taking heavy losses. As a result, in 58 BC, Caro began the practice of branding criminals upon their conviction, especially escaped slaves, in order to constantly remind themselves and others of their shameful nature. Upon returning from his campaign, he enacted a plan to rearrange the city center of Caeum along particular lines of urban development, hoping to relocate the whole construction site of the Senate chambers there. He was fiercely resisted by the Logistics Council, that voluntary economic body of Lagunas' design, and so they would spar for the next 2 years in the formal legal channels which ruled over the capital, which were still in their infancy, developing in preparation for a senate to streamline it. In 56 BC, Caro fell ill and attempted to balance the budget as well as his health by carrying out a sacrifice to Melkart. Meanwhile, to the east, Rome declared war upon Carthage yet again, invading their portion of Iberia by the sea. Carthage, a shadow of its former glory, lost the war almost immediately, ceding the rest of Sicily to Rome, while a variety of local powers broke away from the empire, totally uncontested. This itself led to a civil war between the ruling Suffet of Carthage and one of his governors in Iberia. A daughter was born to Caro upon his recovery, who he named Aema. In 55 BC, Avarignia answered a call to arms from Illyrigatia, which was staging an invasion against several of its neighbors. This war was over rather quickly, and on the heels of this victory, Caro was able to set up an interim senatorial advisory council as an attaché of the tribal council, leading them to embrace a more democratic system of internal governance until the construction of the Senate chambers. Meanwhile, in 54 BC, Rome invaded Avarignia, judging that they had gotten too comfortable in their position during the empire's internal woes. In 51 BC, after several years of peace, the former Carthaginian vassal state of Cephia declared war on Avarignia, laying waste to Elbaconus, Ericolum, Visaria, and Centum Caelas. Caro reached out to the eastern allies, only to find that they had abandoned him. One and all, they failed to answer the call, some bribed and others threatened by the northern power base of the Carthaginian revolt in Bydro. The chief was disgusted at this behavior, and dissolved all relations with them effective immediately. Over the course of the next 3 years, his wrath on this southern campaign was so great that he managed to extract the province of Opidanus from them in the ensuing peace deal, a treaty which they themselves chartered in the hopes of sending the Avarigines home. In 51 BC, Caro Caritas, champion of the Republic, suddenly died in flagrante delicto at the age of 69. He was succeeded by Ancasta Isabella, a 73-year-old woman who was unlikely to change the course of her predecessor's reforms. However, she soon proved herself a deviant spendthrift when she spent much of the treasury on her lavish wedding to a Celt 40 years her junior, Avitus Iacchus. Ironically, this would propel his family to heights unknown by Celts in Avarignia. Many hated the chiefess for this act of rash frivolity. In 47 BC, Ancasta Isabella developed dementia, cared for by her servants rather than her young husband, who now spent her money on lavish parties in her absence. A cruel man, many despised him more than they hated her. To the east in 45 BC, Persia was finally conquered by Tylos, Nabatea broke away from Phrygia, and the Maurya Empire was refashioned into the Magadha Empire under the direction of a new dynasty at the helm. In 44 BC, Chieftess Ancasta Isherbella died of a heart attack at the age of 80, her husband Avitus being beaten to death by a crowd at her funeral, himself dying at the age of 38. The new chief was the 62-year-old Raduceno Coridus, ready to actively carry on the work of bringing about the Republic. He first circumvented the Logistics Council, bested them in court, and brought the Senate chambers over the halfway mark to completion. 3 years later, with more progress made on it than in the entirety of the past century, the Senate chambers were finished in 41 BC, standing resplendent in the very center of Caeum. 300 senators were elected by the landowning Avarignian elite, and Chief Raduceno was allowed to serve out his term as chief, while the council was allowed immediate and unelected seats on this first senate, taking up 30 of the 300 available positions. This senate was dubbed the Athraeum, meaning Hall of Honor in the Avarignian tongue. The chief, in order to protect the Republic, on the eve of its creation, embarked on a bureaucratic purge, hunting down and arresting members of the Indicidi clan, occasionally killing them in their homes if they were particularly powerful individuals. One of the most prominent was the High Priestess, Avena Indicida, who was sacrificed on an altar to Melkart for her secret Simulchian sympathies. Melkart was useful as a god of merchants, but also that, as a Carthaginian god, his priests accepted human sacrifice. Susion Indicidus was next, the tribal war chief, and it was much too dangerous to allow him to retain his troops. He fought when they came for his arrest and killed 5 men, eventually falling to his own blade in the upstairs room of his estate, before a shrine to Simulchi. These measures, known to history simply as the Terror, led the head of the Indicidi clan, Secatunin Indicida, to call up her family and its retinues to their stronghold in Aravorum to the south. While civil war had not yet broken out, the stage was certainly set for one, as each side began to prepare for dark days on the horizon. But then, suddenly, he died of some sickness, and Avarignia officially became a republic on the 24th of April, 39 BC, electing Ariovistus Coridus as its first archon. From thenceforth, archons would rule for 5 years as elected from amongst members of the Senate itself, and could seek re-election 10 years after the end of their first term. The first Senate of the Athraeum, so called as the Senate serving under the first archon, immediately split along personal and business interests, resulting in the dominant populist faction, headed by the zealously Republican Credi family, followed by the religious faction, mercantile faction, military faction, and civic faction. The first actions of the Athraeum were to pass a flurry of laws, chief among them being the institution of a state-controlled grain stockpile, land appropriation reform concerning the mediation of private property negotiations between private individuals and government entities, wherein the state deems such private property so necessary to the functioning of the state, and enacting a state religion, namely grafting in the religious apparatus of the native Iberic gods into the state itself so as to suppress foreign faiths or subversive cults, namely the Simulchian cult. One large issue with all this, however, is that all of the territory south of the Duero River was effectively not governed by Avarignia, but rather by the Indicidi family and the Simulchian cult, to the point that the two were synonymous with each other and with the concept of government in that region. As a result, the Athraeum prompted Ariovistus to negotiate with them, requesting fealty in exchange for allowing them worship of their ancestor south of the river, and a significant general tax cut. This worked, and the armies of the Indicidi stood down, at least for now. Meanwhile, Carthage conquered a small city on the northern coast of Iberia, and far to the east, the Medes had conquered most of Tylos, gaining access to the Sinus Persicus. In 43 BC, Crete had completed their long-awaited conquest of Egypt as a whole, ruling with an iron will from their home island to the north, finally counted among the great empires of history, soon conquering Nabatea also, and sparking a rivalry with Phrygia which would last for centuries. On the 6th of May, 34 BC, Archon Abarabon Coridus of the populist faction was elected to office, leading the second Senate of the Athraeum in its rule of Avarignia. Early in his administration, a son was born to him named Colchis. Meanwhile, a portion of the Indocidi clan, dissatisfied that their family had taken the deal, struck out on their own and took some loyal retinues to various neighboring kingdoms and chiefs, seeking whom they may supplant. In 30 BC, they succeeded, overcoming Alencia and founding the Kingdom of Sardinia under King Balcar Indochidus. This kingdom would come to be a close ally of Rome, but also the cultic center of Simulchianism for as long as people revered that honored ancestor, who had come to be known as Cheliatus, or Honored Mother, though most knew her simply by her name. On the 10th of May, 29 BC, Archon Tatingica Carida of the mercantile faction was elected to office, leading the Third Senate of the Athraeum in its rule of Avarignia. She immediately enacted laws which benefited her faction at the expense of others, angering her aunt and the head of the Caridi family, Aratunan Carida. She even received an ultimatum from her aunt that she would be deposed according to the old ways if she persisted in her party politics. And yet she did not relent. She had faith in the armies of the Senate to protect her at all costs. In September, Ilergetia called for aid in defending against 8 of its neighbors, but Archon Tatingica declined, preferring to keep the forces of the Senate at hand for use against her aunt. Though these threats all came to naught. She knew it, and so did her aunt. The Athraeum they had made was now too strong for such a challenge. Avarignia was a proud, established republic, and after centuries of struggle and sacrifice, they had not only survived, but came to dominate their peninsula. Still, even with all of this, Avarignia by 27 BC was still somewhat of a footnote in world history. Titans of civilization still took center stage, like Rome, Phrygia, and Crete. Still, this world was the way it was only because Avarignia had its role to play in history. 30 more Athraeum would come and go, with relatively uneventful but steady development under the new order. This was until 33 AD, when, far to the east, a Jewish carpenter in Judea was crucified for claiming to be God. A small cult would form around stories of his miracles, death, and resurrection. That same year, and these cultists would contend that it was that same day, far to the north on an icy, uninhabited island, a volcano erupted with such force and magnitude that it would plunge the world into a period of frost and famine, which would make the cold ground hard and unyielding from horizon to horizon for unbroken centuries, killing millions and bringing the progress of entire civilizations to a grinding halt. That cult would soon be outlawed by Ghazni Nasat, king of Judea, in 35 AD. A small clutch of followers and early converts then dispersed, though they found the most purchase heading east along the Silk Road, past the Magadha Empire, to lands distant and mysterious. Though, as they traveled east with the promise of eternal life, something else traveled west with the promise of unending death. A pestilence, great and terrible, swept across the world and began to kill untold millions. In its first year alone, it took nearly 15 million lives. Most places had not even the time to figure out what was happening before they found they had to give everything simply to remain afloat. Between this age of frost and the pestilence, the world had borne a disfiguring wound. Over the centuries, transit times between towns became prohibitive as roads broke down and infrastructure decayed. Literacy became a lost art to the masses, and many writings slipped into the darkness forever. This terrible disease, and iterations of it, would keep the populations of the known world in a suppressed state of constant roiling disease for over 800 years, while those who survived would often starve to death because the pallid sun withheld its light. This was the state of the world. Education, exploration, innovation, it all ground to a halt as Europe lost contact with even its closest neighbors in the Middle East. It was entombed as if in a grave, and within this grave many dreamed that this was the end, that the gods had died, and soon the earth itself would die. But no, it was the beginning, and this beginning began with a generational mound of putrescent corpses.